Luke spat. In Western Vale, Australia, Antonio Reynolds lost control of his vehicle while navigating a narrow mountain pass. He hit a ute belonging to Luke Guerra. Both died instantly. Luke turned his eyes back to the road and gasped. Chapter 40. Wax Museum. As Jared pulled his car into one of the dozens of empty parking spots, it was hard not to stare at the garish sign hung on the building ahead. Fat Clifford's fantastic wax sculptures, painted in bright carnival colours and exaggerated letters, seemed strangely irreverent that evening. Dark clouds had gathered to cover the moon, and a freezing wind tugged at Jared's coat as he left the car and approached the staff entrance at the back of the building. A tall, pinch-nosed woman was waiting for him inside. She exhaled audibly as he entered, then grabbed his sleeve and pulled him farther into the building. "You're the new guard, aren't you? Thank goodness. My daughter's birthday dinner is tonight and I'm already late for it." "Oh, sorry, I thought I was on time." "You are. Here, keys to the building. I'll show you the security booth. You've done night guard work before, right?" Jared hesitated only a fraction of a second. "Oh, yeah." In truth, it was his first time. He'd been surprised by how fast the process was. He'd applied that morning, had a phone interview in the afternoon, and been told to show up at 10 o'clock that night. He wasn't about to complain, though. His rent was 3 weeks overdue, and he would have shoveled trash if anyone had been hiring for it. "Here." The woman, Simone, according to her name tag, ushered him into a small booth. 8 screens with black and white feed were set above a simple desk. "Did Clifford explain the job to you?" The interview had been so fast that Jared had barely gotten the address. "Watch the building?" "That's it, in a nutshell." She pointed to the screens. "These wax sculptures are incredibly expensive. Keep an eye on them to make sure no one breaks in to steal or damage them. Watch the screens, and once an hour, walk through the building. Those are Clifford's express instructions. The screens capture most of the rooms, but the hourly walkthrough is very important to double-check everything is fine." And, Jared adjusted his tie, which suddenly felt too tight. "What happens if it's not?" Simone blinked at him. "Then you fix it." Look, I've got to go. I'm so late. You'll be fine. Just do the walkthrough every hour and watch the screens. It's a stupidly simple job." Jared continued to fiddle with his tie as he listened to her footsteps fade and the metal staff entrance door slam. Just like the interview, his introduction to the job had happened so quickly that he felt as if he were trying to correct his balance on a constantly rocking boat. He stood in the booth for a few moments, half expecting someone would come back and give him a proper job description, then sighed and rubbed his hands through his hair. "It's cool. It's a stupidly easy job. Like she said, you'll be fine." A torch stood on the desk by the screens, and Jared picked it up. He searched through the drawers in case he'd also been given a weapon, but there was no such luck. All that remained was a stick of gum, probably left there by the last guard. Without anything else to do, Jared turned on the torch and left the booth for his first walkthrough. It didn't take long for him to become hopelessly lost. "Should have turned the lights on," he thought bitterly, as he found himself at a dead end. However, Simone hadn't shown him where the switches were, and his narrow beam of light showed him only tiny slices of the space with each step. The wax museum was larger than he'd expected. At least a dozen rooms held countless wax figures, eerily lifelike and horribly plastic. He passed celebrities, historical figures, and even book characters. Every time he turned his torch, a new face was staring at him, fake eyes, hair, and smiles catching in the beam. Cold sweat trickled down Jared's back. During the interview, he'd been told the previous night guard had quit without notice, and he was starting to understand why. If he hadn't been desperate for the money, he would have walked out right then. As he continued farther into the house of shadowed, awkwardly posed models, he somehow found himself in a room of deformed figures. Their heads lolled at awkward angles, some were missing limbs, and others were partially melted. They had been arranged along the walls, all facing the door, their twisted visages enough to make Jared feel faintly sick. Suspecting the room wasn't part of the public tour, he backed out of the room. The glassy eyes and lopsided smiles followed him until he closed the door. It was an immeasurable relief when he caught sight of light coming from below the booth's door. He hurried to it and locked himself inside. The tie still felt too tight, so he loosened it some more, then pressed a hand over his heart. The guard's booth was small, but at least it was brightly lit. Jared slumped into the chair behind the desk and ran his hands over his face. He guessed the wax museum must be charming and interesting by day, when the lights were on and the signs were easy to read. At night, though, it had turned into something out of his worst nightmares. Jared was glad to be away from it. Well, mostly away from it. The 8 screens showed several of the horrific scenes in black and white night vision. For some reason, one of the cameras was pointed towards the storage room holding the deformed sculptures. Their eyes shone white through the camera, the way an animal's flash in the light. The chills wouldn't abate. Jared got to his feet, felt behind the screens, and pulled the plug he found there. The images disappeared in a faint whine, and the empty black was a relief in comparison. "I'll look for another job," Jared promised himself as he lolled back in the chair. "As soon as I get one, I can ditch this place. Maybe I just won't turn up one day, like that last chap. I don't know why this place even needs a security guard at night anyway, and the hourly walkthroughs feel pointless. What can my presence achieve that a cheap motion sensor won't do more efficiently and for a fraction of the price?" Time seemed to crawl by. Jared had brought a novel, but he didn't feel like reading. Instead, he leaned back in the chair, folded his arms, and closed his eyes in an attempt to relax. He started awake some time later. It took him a moment to remember where he was, then he checked his watch. It was nearly 4 in the morning. His shift would only last for 2 more hours. His first emotion was guilt at failing to do what had been described as a stupidly simple job. His second was gratitude that he'd woken before his negligence could be discovered. He sat up in the chair and groaned as a pinched nerve in his neck made itself felt. Skrrr, skrrr. Jared snapped his attention towards the booth's door. Something was scratching at its outside. His heart skipped a beat as he half rose out of the seat. Scrooch! Scrooch! He mouthed a swear word as panic hit. Jared scrambled for the back of the monitor system and replugged it. All 8 screens blinked for a second, then resumed their feed. He scanned them, but none of them showed the hallway outside the security booth. Scrooch! Scrooch! Crap. His nerves were hot. There was no phone inside the booth, and he'd left his mobile at home. There was no way to contact the outside world without leaving. Jared lifted his torch, base turned outwards to use as a bludgeon, and prepared to turn the handle. He held a small hope that it might be a prank, a welcome to the job hazing, but he was fully prepared to slam the door closed if it was anything else. Scrooge! He swung the door open, and the scraping fell silent. Outside the room stood a tall sculpture of a woman in a historical dress, her eyes directed towards Jared's face, her smile unnaturally wide. She was motionless, but her fingers were still extended, their strangely realistic nails held in the exact place they would need to be to scratch at the booth's door. Jared ran. His torch's beam jittered over the walls, floors, and countless leering wax figures. They'd moved, he was sure. They no longer stood on their pedestals, but blocked the walkways. Jared ducked and wove about them, his heart ready to explode, and was certain he could hear shuffling footsteps behind him. The building was a maze, and he could have cried his relief when he recognized the hallway to the staff entrance. He burst through the metal door, dashed down the 4 steps to the car park, and threw himself into the only remaining vehicle, his car. As he turned towards the area's exit, he saw a man blocking the road. Jared slowed the car as he neared, and he realized the shape in the harsh beams of his headlights wasn't flesh and blood as he'd first thought, but a wax figure. The man was tall and wide-set, wearing a blue coat, hands planted on hips, beady eyes staring unwaveringly at the car. A big name tag on his lapel read Fat Clifford. Jared had let the car come to a halt. A quiet click was all the warning he had that the passenger door had been opened. He looked to his side, where one of the deformed melted mannequins was halfway into his car. A contorted hand stretched towards Jared's tie. Without hesitation, he hit the accelerator. The car jerked forward, throwing the reaching wax figure out, and screeched towards Fat Clifford. The statue's wild smile didn't falter as the car hit it, knocked it down, and bounced over it. Jared sucked in thin, terrified breaths. He kept both feet pressed to the accelerator as he urged the car to take him as far from Fat Clifford's fantastic wax sculptures as possible. Chapter 41. Bog Rot. Meg fished through her purse. He wasn't any trouble, was he? Tara, her schoolbooks tucked under one arm, shook her head so vigorously that her hair fluttered around her face. Nah, he went to bed early and hasn't stirred since. Good. Meg produced the promised $20 and added an extra $5. She'd been away for nearly an hour longer than she'd anticipated. She could only be grateful that Tara was patient enough to wait for her. Tara said her goodbyes and hurried to her car while Meg let herself into the house. The building was still and dark. Meg didn't expect her husband home for another hour or two. It was football night for him, and sometimes he wouldn't come home until the early morning, tired and delighted, smelling of cheap beer. Meg dropped her car keys and purse onto the kitchen counter, then went to her son's room. She kept the hall light off and pressed the door open gently, expecting Riley to be asleep. The boy was sitting bolt upright in his bed, though, and he gasped when Meg opened the door. She turned on the light and went to him. "Hey, honey, what's wrong?" His dark eyes, so much like his father's, blinked at her from under long lashes. "Bad dream." His eyes immediately turned to the window. "Want to tell me about it?" Meg asked, sitting on the edge of his bed. She could hear their dog Jasper barking in the yard. "Something's gotten him worked up. I'll have to check on him before bed." Riley gave his mother a sidelong glance but hesitated, seemingly uncertain how to start. "Have you ever heard of the bog rot?" Meg quirked her eyebrows up. "Nope. What's that?" "Tara was telling me about them." Riley shrugged and pulled the blankets farther up his body. "She says one's been following her." Meg pursed her lips. "She shouldn't be telling you scary stories, especially not before bedtime." Riley's huge eyes turned back to Meg, desperately sincere in his desire not to get his babysitter in trouble. "Don't blame Tara. I made her. I begged her and begged her to tell me the scariest story she could. She didn't really want to, but I made her tell me about the bog rot." Bog rot sounded like exactly the sort of name a young adult would choose for a fictional monster. Meg sighed. "Okay, why don't you tell me about this bog rot? And I'll tell you if I think it's scary." Riley shrugged. She could tell he was trying to look nonchalant, but the way his eyes kept flicking to the window gave him away. "Well," he said, speaking slowly, "she said there was a monster, which she called the bog rot, that used to follow her around at night, and she didn't like going outside after dark because of it." Meg followed her son's eyes to the window, where the moonlight pierced the thick trees at the back of the yard. Jasper's barking was becoming more frantic. He's probably found a raccoon. And what exactly does a bog rot do? It makes squelching noises when it follows her. She says it hides in the shadows so it's hard to see, but it has yellow eyes and really long claws. That sounds ridiculous. He's getting too old to be frightened of monsters. And it scared you so badly you had a nightmare? Riley bristled. You didn't hear the way she described it, like it could really be there, waiting for me to step outside, waiting for you. He shivered and pulled back his blanket still higher. And I thought I heard you call Jasper from the back of the garden, and Jasper was barking and barking and barking, and then suddenly there was a snap of huge teeth, and... Riley turned his huge eyes towards his mother. Meg felt a stab of guilt for teasing her son. Of course an 8-year-old would be disturbed if he dreamed his pet had been eaten. She pulled Riley into a hug and squeezed him tightly. Hey, it's okay. The bog rot didn't get Jasper. You can hear him barking, can't you? He's fine. Yeah, Riley said, though he didn't sound convinced. It seemed so real, though. It can't have been, honey. Meg brushed Riley's golden blonde hair out of his face and kissed his forehead. I only just got home. There's no way I could have been calling Jasper. Riley hesitated, and Meg guessed she wasn't getting the full story. She raised her eyebrows at him in silent question, and he shrugged. It's just the other thing Tara said. She said the bog rot can imitate human voices. So it could have been the bog rot at the back of the yard calling Jasper, and he thought it was you, and... Riley shook his head and squeezed his eyes closed. Never mind. I don't want to think about it. Meg sighed. She had no idea what Tara had been thinking, coming up with such a ghastly story. The only comfort was Jasper's persistent barking. Meg gave her son's forehead a kiss, then stood and approached the window. The clear moonlight painted over the closer patches of grass, but the trees filled the back of the yard with shadows. A glint of silver caught Meg's eyes, and she saw a dog tag lying on the ground next to fur. A clump of fur, golden brown with blood-stained tips, lay next to Jasper's tag. Meg raised her eyes, searching the yard for the barking dog, and saw 2 faintly glowing globes hidden in the shadows at the back of the yard. Then the globes blinked as the bog rot barked and barked and barked. Chapter 42. Beanie's Fast Food. Beanie's plastic eyes surveyed the restaurant as his wide smile stretched his rosy cheeks. Paulie always made a point of tapping the bright yellow button on Beanie's suit whenever he passed, as though the giant plastic torso could bring him the good luck. He did so then as he crossed to the door at the back of the restaurant, 2 garbage bags clenched in his other fist. He could hear Jen, Paulie's co-worker, grumbling as she sorted the inventory in the walk-in fridge. She hated the closing shift as much as Paulie did. He shoved through the narrow door at the back of the building and used one foot to slow its closing so that it would hit the latch but not lock. The cold night air bit at his face and ears. He jogged towards the dumpsters at the opposite side of the car park, trying to keep up his momentum and reminding himself that he would be home in another 20 minutes. Paulie was halfway across the car park when a bang startled him. He turned, surveying the nearby streets, which were empty. The parking lot had only 3 cars, his, Jen's, and another he didn't recognize. The car possibly belonged to a druggie or a drunk who'd forgotten where he'd parked. It had happened before. Their branch of Beanie's Fast Food was nestled on the edge of a not-so-pleasant part of town. Train lines ran behind the parking lot, and every half an hour a carriage would whistle past, drowning out their customers' voices. The slums on the other side of the tracks housed some of the strangest people Paulie had ever met, and he'd met his fair share of weirdos. He couldn't count the number of employees his boss, Jacob, had fired, and for far more extreme reasons than he'd ever anticipated. Selling drugs over the counter was a common one, but 2 cooks had been let go for trying to deep-fry a rat, and one employee had tried to gouge out a customer's eye. Some days, Paulie felt as if he, Jen, and Jacob were the only sane people left in the world. Paulie pushed the dumpster's lid open and threw the bags inside. "Nearly the end of your shift, buddy," he reminded himself as he turned back to the store's sooty back entrance. "Then you get to enjoy opening shift tomorrow, too. Hooray!" The street lamps spaced around the car park left stark circles of light on the black asphalt. Paulie didn't like walking through them and skirted around their edges, eager to get inside the relatively warm eatery. He hesitated at the door. It was pulled tightly closed. Must have been the wind. That could have been what the slamming noise was, the door being forced closed. Muttering under his breath, Paulie unlocked the door and pushed inside. The back areas were far less orderly and clean than they kept the parts of the kitchen visible to the public, but between himself and Jen, they managed to stop it from getting too disgusting. Paulie could still hear Jen in the walk-in fridge, muttering to herself as she counted off inventory and made a list for Jacob to reorder goods the following morning. Paulie grabbed the broom from the corner of the room and returned to the front of store, where the floor was permanently in need of cleaning. He raised a hand to tap Beanie's bright gold button out of habit, then pulled his hand back as he touched something wet. What the hell? A red substance had been smeared across the plastic mascot's neck, connecting one ear to the other in a gory replica of a cut throat. The substance had dribbled over the torso, including the button Paulie liked to tap. Paulie's mouth felt dry. He stared at the mascot, too confused to feel proper shock. I was only outside for a couple of minutes. Who could have done this? Not Jen, surely. As if on cue, Jen rounded the corner and stopped short at the sight of the defaced statue. Her eyes roved from the red splatter to Paulie's tinted fingertips, and a scowl settled above her dark eyes. What the hell, Paulie? The shocked indignation in her voice convinced Paulie that she had no knowledge of the vandalism. That was enough to shake him out of his stupor, and he took a step back, feeling revolted. "Wasn't me," he said. He pressed his thumb against the red liquid on his index finger, trying to guess its origin based on its viscousness. As he rubbed his fingers together, the substance began to dry and tack in the way only one thing could. Blood. "Don't be an ass," Jen snapped, moving closer to the mascot. She squinted at the stains, seeming reluctant to touch them. "I mean, it looks like it, but—" "I thought I heard the door slam," Paulie said, as the memory came back to him. "When I was taking the trash out. That wasn't you?" Jen's eyes scoured his face, testing his truthfulness. Then she swore under her breath and pulled out her phone. "If this is really blood, geez, I'm calling Jacob. I'm not paid enough to deal with this sort of crap." Paulie couldn't stop staring at the mascot. The blood had been smeared deliberately to replicate a cut throat. Is that a threat? Who'd want to threaten us? Could be a dismissed employee, I guess, or maybe a customer who really hated their food. A strange, haunting jingle came from farther in the store. Both Paulie and Jen swung towards it. From what Paulie could tell, its source was somewhere near the back of the dining room. "It's the boss's phone," Jen said, taking her mobile away from her ear and glancing about the shadowed eatery. "He's still here." Paulie remembered the third car left beside his and Jen's in the parking lot. It had been too deep in the shadows to see clearly, but it could have been Jacob's. "Come on," Jen said, pushing past Paulie to cross the dining area. "I'm not going to stand for any sick pranks." Her voice was strong, but he thought he detected a note of anxiety hidden in it. He followed her as the haunting jingle led them to the bathrooms at the back of the building. The ringtone came from the men's, and Jen pushed in without hesitation. "Jacob?" she called, and to her credit, she hesitated only a second before striding towards the stalls. "What the hell do you think you're playing at?" Paulie froze in the doorway, his nerves on fire and the hair on his arms standing on end. Only one stall had its door closed, the last one in the row. It wasn't fully shut, though. The door had been pulled to, but not locked. "Jen," Paulie said, and the word rasped across his dry lips. "Jen, don't." She either ignored him or hadn't heard him, just like she hadn't heard the dripping sound, barely audible above Jacob's ringtone, or seen the trickle of dark blood running from inside the stall and dribbling towards the drain. Jen pushed open the stall door, and her scowl morphed into an expression of absolute terror. Chapter 43. 99 Messages. Just inside his apartment's front door, Mirko dropped his suitcase on the floor and sighed. He took a moment to bask in the blissful silence and stretch the knots out of his back. Work had been grueling, and he was looking forward to running a hot bath and reheating the previous night's leftovers. Mirko crossed the room to the sideboard and pressed the flashing button on his answering machine. He untied his shoes and kicked them off as he listened to the mechanical female voice. "You have 99 new messages." Mirko hesitated, one foot raised, ready to pull off his sock. 99? That can't be right. First new message received today at 8:46 a.m. He left for work at 8:45 on the dot. He must have just barely missed the call. There were several seconds of silence. Then a voice, oddly crackly, said, "Hello, Mirko. I'm going to start counting now. Are you ready?" Both socks off, Mirko gave the answering machine his full attention. The voice was silent for nearly half a minute. Then it said, calmly and precisely, 99. The message bank beeped, and the mechanical voice returned. Next new message received today at 8:49 a.m. Again, after a second of silence, the unfamiliar voice said, 98. Mirko rubbed his thumbs into the corner of his eyes. Is this some kind of joke? He didn't recognize the voice. It had no discernible accent, but spoke in an odd monotone lacking both inflection and emotion. He couldn't even tell if it belonged to a man or a woman. Crackles, as though the voice was speaking through a walkie-talkie, accompanied it. Next new message received today at 8:52 a.m. 97. It's not seriously counting down from 100, is it? Mirko glanced at the number flashing on the side of his machine. 96 new messages. How long would it have taken someone to record all of these? He mashed his thumb into the button on the side of the machine, deleting messages before they played. He watched the number of unheard messages drop from the 90s down to 50, then 20, then 10. Once he'd reached the third last message, he released the button to let it play. Next new message received today at 12:18 p.m. You forgot to lock your door this morning, Mirko. 3. Mirko slowly turned towards the rear of his house. The hairs on the backs of his arms rose. Next new message received today at 12:21 p.m. Mirko, have you found a weapon yet? 2. This is a joke. A sick, strange joke. Mirko turned back to the answering machine, where the number 1 flashed on the screen. Next new message received today at 12:25 p.m. Are you ready, Mirko? 1. A long, loud beep followed as the phone marked all messages listened to. Mirko turned slowly, swallowing the dry taste in his mouth. For a moment, his apartment was filled with complete, perfect silence. Then there was a quiet click as someone fastened the lock on his front door. Chapter 44. Death Follows. Death's exhale was a protracted, scraping rattle. It conjured memories of dead leaves skittering over dirt, fingernails drawing across gravestones, or an elderly man's final rasp. It wasn't unfamiliar to John. He was at the head of his driveway, and it took a moment of searching to spot the black shadow nestled in the corner of his neighbor's house, where the vines grew thick and the slanted roof blocked out most of the waning light. The spectre looked near identical to a shadow, save for its movements and the flash of light reflecting off its eyes. It was taller than a human, but its back and shoulders were stooped. Its unnaturally long fingers twitched at its side as it stared at John. He turned, put his hands into his pockets and began walking to town. His job as a spirit medium had introduced him to the spectre. Curiosity in life after death of spirits and lost souls had increased dramatically at the turn of the century, and John's unique talents had allowed him to charge a rich sum for contacting the husbands, sons, and daughters of grieving women. The spirits would answer his call and communicate messages through taps, chills, and whispers. John had been a spirit medium for close to a year when he first saw death. During his work, he'd given a great deal of thought to the souls and where they went after their mortal bodies perished, but none to the entity that reaped them. Then, one evening, he'd glimpsed the shadow in the back of an elderly widow's parlour. Its lamp-like eyes were fixated on her bowed head, and a sense of unease had prickled at John's skin and made his saliva bitter. He'd left early. The following morning, he received word that the widow had passed in her sleep. Since then, he'd seen death lingering around men and women who were near the end of their time on earth. The creature was infallible, and this time it had come for John. He picked up his pace and heard the scrape of long, steady footsteps behind him. Death had seemingly endless patience, he'd learned. The intended victims would live hours or even days after the spectre began trailing them. That gives me time, he thought, though he didn't know what he intended to use that time for. His first thought was to settle his affairs, but he had no wife and no children to settle on. There was no one he cared about to say goodbye to. As a spirit medium, he travelled through town so quickly that he never became attached to the inhabitants. At the end of his lane, the road split. Left went towards town, right led into the countryside. John paused, considering his options. He didn't dare turn around, but he could hear the spectre coming closer, moving to stand in his shadow, to breathe its fetid, icy breath across the back of his neck. He turned right. If he was going to die, he would do it in a discreet place where his body wouldn't cause too much distress. The forest, perhaps, or he could sit on the bridge over the river and hope to keel into the water and be swept away. John was faintly surprised by his serenity in the face of his own death. He'd seen so much of it in the previous year of his life, had called up so many spirits that mortality no longer held any horror for him, at least not the kind of horror normal people tasted. He was inevitably asked the same questions at each séance. Does it hurt? Are you happy? The replies were always comforting, but a theory had grown in John over his year of conducting séances. If I were trapped in a realm of constant suffering, would I reveal that to my grieving wife when there is nothing she can do? Or would I lie, knowing that at least one of us would be happier for it? John wiped the back of his hand over his lips. The fingers were shaking. Death no longer followed at a safe distance, but stayed near enough to touch, those sickening rattles echoing in John's ear with every exhale. He was tempted to bargain, but he already knew the creature was beyond reason. It wasn't the intelligent, scythe-carrying skeleton often portrayed in stories. Death was impassionate, uncaring, animalistic in its thoughts and intentions. No silver tongue could persuade the being away from its course. The river wasn't far ahead. John had been hoping to sit on the edge of the railing while he waited, but to his frustration, he saw a man already stood there, leaning on the wood and watching the water below. "Lo!" the stranger called as John neared. He didn't see the extra shadow trailing John. No one ever saw it. John gave a curt nod, intending to cross the bridge and find a quieter place to die, but the stranger turned towards him, a lopsided grin growing over his face. "You're the medium, aren't you? My aunt had you for a séance last week." "Ah." John hated to stop when the spectre was so close in his wake, but a strange thought occurred to him. He stopped next to the man, close to the edge of the river, and gave him a quick look over. He was young, no more than 25, and had dressed casually, probably planning to spend the day outdoors. "Do you have much interest in the next life?" The man laughed and clapped John on the shoulder. "I intend no offense, understand, but I firmly believe your kind are charlatans, the lot of you." John's smile was tighter than he would have liked it. He looked behind them. Death stood close, its bony, unnaturally long fingers raised to caress John's shoulder. The world seemed to lose colour when he looked at the spectre. For a moment, all he could see was the flash of light playing over its sightless eyes. "It's impulsive, animalistic. I wonder—" He reached into his pocket. His companion had returned to gazing over the edge of the bridge, teeth sparkling in the dull sunlight. "I'm sure your antics are good for an evening's entertainment, but I don't believe for a second you do anything more than comfort the grieving." "You'll believe soon enough." John flipped the knife out effortlessly and drew it across the man's throat. A gush of red poured from the cut, and the man's smile finally disappeared into a horrified shriek. John pressed his hand over the man's mouth, silencing him, as they watched his lifeblood drain into the river below. He spoke quickly, desperately. "I won't ask your forgiveness, but death expects a victim. Please, stand in my stead." There was so much red, so much more than John had anticipated. His companion's eyes rolled back into his head, and the grabbing hands stilled and fell. John let the man slump over the bridge's railing. Death no longer watched him, but the creature's mouth opened a fraction to reveal the flash of discoloured teeth. It draped itself across the dying man and ate. John watched for a moment, sweat pouring down his face and his limbs, so unsteady that he was afraid he might collapse. Then he threw the knife into the river, skirted around the feeding shadow, and ran. Chapter 45. After Closing. Seren woke with a snort. His neck hurt. The pain radiated down his spine and into his left arm. He sat up, trying to figure out where he was, and bumped his head on something hard. What? He glanced up and saw the underside of a scratched wooden desk. Familiar smells reached him then: paper, disinfectant, and the tang from the sickly sweets kept in a bowl on the help bench, and he remembered. The library. I slipped under the desk to have a nap before going home. What time is it? Seren pushed the chair out of his way and crept out from under the bench. The lights were out and the library was deathly quiet. He'd slept through closing, he realized, with a flush of mingled embarrassment and light anxiety. There's got to be a way to open the doors from the inside, right? I won't be locked in here until morning, will I? He got to his feet and cringed as pins and needles shot down his leg. He held still, one hand grasping the back of the chair, the other resting on the desk where his schoolbooks were still stacked, while he waited for the blood flow to return to the limb. The librarians mustn't have checked the library very thoroughly before going home. I was well hidden under the desk, but there was no way they would have missed me if they'd tried to take my books. A scratching sound drew Seren's attention. Something was moving near the back of the library. He frowned and crept forward to see around the nearby bookshelf. There shouldn't be anyone else here, not at this time of night. As he leaned forward to see around the shelf, Seren caught a glimpse of a small figure crouched near the back of the room. It seemed to be digging through the small bin in the corner. Seren stared at it, mesmerized and unable to comprehend what he was seeing, as the figure's dexterous limbs moved. It was bone-thin and naked, and though it was hard to see with only the backwash of the streetlights filtering through the library's window, he thought its skin was grey. The being in the corner of the room suddenly stopped its rummaging. Its head swiveled, the neck spinning past a normal human's range to face Seren. He caught a glimpse of red-pink eyes behind strands of long, greasy black hair. Then he ducked out of sight and pressed his back to the shelf as his heart thundered in his ears. What was that? It's not human, that's for sure. He held his breath and listened. After a moment, the faint scratching sounds resumed. Maybe it didn't see me. Maybe it's blind. Against his better judgment, Seren edged closer to the edge of the shelf and carefully extended his head forward to see the corner of the room. The bin was still there, but the creature had gone. Seren's mouth dried as he pulled back again. Cold sweat built across his torso. I've got to get out of here. He was near the back of the library. The entrance stood 24 paces away past the help desk. Seren, moving as quietly as he could, turned to grab his books. The creature stood directly behind him, within touching distance, its huge red eyes framed in heavy shadows. Seren froze. He opened his mouth. Whether to speak or scream he wasn't sure, but no noise escaped him. The being's eyes narrowed, and it reached towards him. The fingers were far longer than they had any right to be, with at least 5 knuckles each. They ended in sharpened claws, and Seren felt as though his heart might explode as they stretched towards his face. He jolted backwards without realizing what he was doing and hit the library shelf. His feet skidded out from under him, and Seren grabbed at the shelves as he topped the ground. His weight was enough to pull the heavy structure free from its bolts and bring it crashing down on both himself and the creature. The books poured from the shelves as it fell, and Seren caught a half-second glimpse of fury blazing in the monster's face before it was smothered. The bookcase landed on Seren's leg, which was still numb from when he'd fallen asleep, and he grunted through his teeth. "Get up, idiot! Run!" Seren pulled his legs out from under the books, gained his feet, and staggered towards the library's door. He thought he could hear the skittering, clawing noise again, but when he turned, the room behind him was still except for the settling pile of books. The library's doors had motion sensors to open them, but they'd been turned off at closing. Seren tried to wedge his fingertips into the gap between the doors and pull them open, but they wouldn't move. There has to be a spare key or something. Seren turned to put the doors at his back. He could see the fallen shelf silhouette in the back of the room, but saw movement. Is it still there, under the books? Did I kill it? Seren's breaths came as thin wheezes as he moved around the help desk and searched knickknacks hidden there. In the darkness, his hands brushed over paper clips, erasers, pencils, pens, letter holders, and a glass still half full of water, without finding any keys. He swore under his breath, then fell still as he heard the noise again, like fingers brushing across paper. He raised his head to look over the top of the help desk, but he couldn't see any sign of motion or of the red eyes. His lips formed another swear word, but he didn't dare speak it. There's got to be keys. Got to be. Seren turned to look at the wall behind the desk, and then he saw it. A door set between the shelves had been left open. It seemed to be some sort of storage closet, though Seren couldn't remember ever seeing the library staff use it. I'd be safe in there, I bet. I could barricade myself inside and wait until morning. Without a second thought, Seren crossed the distance and stepped into the room, pulling the door closed behind himself. He fished his phone out of his pocket and turned it on to use its light. The glow was too dim to allow him to make out details, but what he could see made his heart freeze. A cot had been set against one wall, with a bucket just below it. The cot had blankets and a pillow, but they were grimy with age. A single chair sat against the opposite wall, taking up the rest of the cramped room. It lives here? Why? How? Does one of the librarians own it, and they let it out at night? Seren backed up against the door, struggling to draw breath. I can't stay here. Not in its home. I've got to get out. Even if I break the glass doors, I could use the chair. He opened the door a crack and edged out of the room, moving his feet in slow sweeps across the carpet to minimize noise, intent on the sliding glass doors. The sound, that faint crackle of nails on paper, came again, and Seren stopped. Every nerve in his body on fire, every hair on his arm standing on end. It's not coming from anywhere ahead of me. Not behind me either, He raised his eyes to where the creature clung to the foam tiles lining the ceiling. Its jaws opened into a vicious smile, exposing rows of sharp teeth. Then it let go, dropping towards Seren. Chapter 46. Growth. A tapping sound startled Mary. She dropped her embroidery and crossed to the window, where Emma's wide smile was distorted by the glass. Her friend beckoned, clearly wanting to speak. Mary shook her head as she pointed back at the house. I can't, she mouthed. Mama will be home soon. Emma wasn't deterred. She beckoned even more eagerly and pointed towards the lane bordering the property. Mary huffed a sigh. Very well, don't work yourself into such a frenzy. She snatched her bonnet off the side table and slipped through the house. The maids were all busy preparing for lunch. If she were lucky, her mother would stay late at Mrs. Crenshaw's and Mary's absence wouldn't even be noticed. Lord, I thought you'd never come, Emma hissed as Mary joined her in the garden. I found something. Come on, come on. Emma took Mary's hand, and she had to pick up her skirts to keep up with Emma's pace. I can't be out long. Where is it? In the forest. Don't worry, it's not far. Mary tried to pull her hand back. When she spoke, her voice was a little harsher than she'd intended. The forest? Are you mad? You know we're not supposed to. It's only a little way in. Emma refused to lessen her grip. You'll love it, I swear. With one final glance back at her home, Mary huffed and allowed herself to be dragged towards the tangle of dark, time-worn trees near the town's edge. When they were children, she and Emma had played in the woods constantly. It was a wild land of hidden glens, streams, and seemingly magical clearings. But eventually, both Emma's and Mary's parents had insisted they keep to the roads. It's time to grow up, they'd said. It's time to focus on worthwhile tasks, to better yourselves as young women, to give up the foolishness of childhood. But it would be a lie for Mary to say she didn't sometimes daydream of the woods. Her protests to Emma were for show, and to assuage her conscience, nothing more. By the time they reached the wood's edge, they were both running. Their cheeks flushed and their breathing ragged. Emma's eyes seemed unusually glossy. Come on, she cried, leading the way between the thick black trunks. It's only a little further. What are you showing me? Mary's dress snagged on a branch, and she gave a little cry as it tore. Mama will be furious. Never mind about that. Come on. This time Mary flushed with anger. What do you mean, never mind? I'll be in so much trouble. It's through here. Come and see. Mary pouted, but obediently climbed the bank of rotting wood to see what Emma was so eager to show her. Her friend knelt in a little hollow. Ahead of her was a cluster of strange fungi, long and tapered like a lady's fingers. Their bases were a grey-green and their tips yellowed. They were strange, Mary thought, but not so noteworthy as to justify a torn dress. Smell them. Emma bent so close to the plants, her eyes glassy and her cheeks pink. I've never smelled anything so delicious. Reluctantly, Mary eased herself into the hollow. As she neared them, the fungi's aroma surrounded her. Emma was right. It smelt like honey, like freshly baked cakes, like lavender and cinnamon and apples and spring rain. She was kneeling behind her friend and marveling at the plants. The dress no longer seemed so important. Being home in time for Mama no longer seemed important. She only wanted to sit and watch the finger-like mushrooms for a little longer. The sun was near setting when she shook herself out of her fugue. We should go. Yes, Emma agreed. Her voice was slurred, and her eyelids half closed. In a minute. We can come back tomorrow, Mary promised. Only a vague sense that she would regret staying much longer made her stand. And the day after, but now we need to go home. Their walk back to the village was far more subdued than the dash away from it had been. They held hands but didn't speak, both lost in their thoughts and unwilling to break the trance. As Mary had suspected, her mother scolded her both for leaving home and for tearing her dress. Her mother screamed at her, pointing to the grass stains on her knees and the leaves in her hair, but it didn't bother Mary. She only nodded when appropriate and apologized when her mother's silence suggested she was expected to. Her thoughts were still with the fungus. She barely slept that night. She dearly wanted to go back to the plant, to see what it looked like at night, but she didn't think she could find the way in the dark. Besides, she didn't want to just see it herself. She wanted to show it to someone else. That was the purpose of pretty things, wasn't it? To share the joy with others. Her mother had explicitly told her not to stir from her room the following day as punishment. But Mary only waited until she saw her mother's hat bob down the street below her window before dashing outside. She knew exactly whom she wanted to lead to the growth. Her family, being one of the wealthier in the village, rarely spoke to the farming family near the woods. But they had a daughter around Mary's age. She found the girl tending to the chickens. It didn't take much to convince her to come to the forest. Where are we going? The girl asked. Mary belatedly realized she couldn't remember the girl's name, but that no longer seemed important. You'll see, she replied, and laughed at how closely the conversation mimicked hers and Emma's from the day before. The hollow already had a visitor. Emma was kneeling next to the fungi. Her hair was disheveled, and she still wore her nightdress, but she didn't seem to care as she turned a dazed smile towards Mary. Oh, you brought a friend. Her fingers were sticky with a thick orange liquid. It looked like honey, but as Emma turned back to the growths, Mary realized it had come from the fungi. Emma had broken one in half and dipped her fingers inside. As she sucked on them, her eyes fluttered closed while she relished the taste. Mary wanted to sample the plant too, but some distant subconscious caution held her back. Don't eat anything that grows in the forest, her mother had said countless times. It could be poisonous. She closed her eyes and contented herself with the smell. The farm girl had been mute, but very slowly settled beside her to be near the mushrooms. Her wide eyes were already developing a dull glaze. Mary stayed as long as she dared, watching the little plants and listening to Emma lick her fingers. When she finally rose, the sun had fallen, but she felt neither hungry nor cold. Even keeping the same position all day had not made her sore. The farm girl obediently stood with her as they turned back to town. Emma stayed. Her time at home was a daze. Her mother screamed at her so violently that spittle flew from the woman's mouth. That didn't matter, though. The food passed through her bedroom door didn't matter. The hot bath didn't matter, and the starry night didn't matter. Nothing mattered until Mary tried to open her door the following morning and found it locked. Then she screamed. shed hot tears, and beat her fists against the door. The doctor arrived. His diagnosis was hysteria, to be treated with seclusion and a pungent herbal blend. Mary hated the medicine. It was so astringent, so acrimonious compared to her mushrooms. She swallowed it so that the doctor would leave her alone, then waited until her family went to bed before cracking open her window. The cold outside air burnt her throat as she ran towards the woods. She was barefoot, but the littered forest floor didn't hurt her. She wore only her nightdress, but the air didn't make her shiver. She followed the route to the fungi as surely as though the map had been branded into her mind. As she stepped into the clearing, she discovered the farm girl had brought more friends. 5 of them knelt in the hollow, but didn't stir as Mary took her place amongst them. Emma lay among the mushrooms. She looked so peaceful that she might have been dead, except for her infrequent halting breaths. The fungi had grown across her, sprouting from her skin in little pretty patches. Their grey and yellow stalks, so much like fingers, quivered every time Emma breathed. It was a sight that might have once filled Mary with revulsion, but at that moment seemed natural and comforting. It was a good thing to have happened. Emma might die, but the fungi would live, growing from her collapsing body and spreading their sweet scent through the forest. Mary no longer felt any of the niggling reluctance that had plagued her over the previous days. Her mind was pleasantly empty as she bent forward, snapped one of the growths off Emma's cheek, and lapped at the honey-like syrup that dribbled from its stalk. Chapter 47. Quarantine. The shuttle door opened with a quiet hiss. Ava pushed inside and floated in the zero gravity while she waited for Tarkle to follow her. He'd been unusually slow that afternoon, and she found herself crossing her arms as her partner drifted through the hatch. "Any time this century," she said, as she pressed the button to close the door. She couldn't see his face under the helmet, but she could imagine the scowl he shot her. "Hey, shut up, it's not like we're on a deadline or anything." Ava sighed and began typing commands into the control panel. "Yeah, sorry, you've just been, I don't know, like you've run out of juice. We've been working together for, 4 years? And I can't ever remember having you follow me before." The gravity normalized as the centrifuge kicked in, and Ava let her boots drift to the floor. She pressed a second button to check the air levels were safe. Then she unlocked her helmet. As she unzipped from her suit, she glanced back at Tarkle and felt a stab of shock. Her partner was pale and sweaty. He looked fine when they'd suited up, but something had obviously affected him during the 4-hour flight. "Hey, is something wrong? You're not looking so hot." Tarkle shot her a tight smile. "I don't feel great, to be honest. My wife was coming down with something this morning. I might have caught it off her. Don't worry about me, though. We'll be back to base in a couple of hours, and I'll take the rest of the day off work if I'm not better by then." "You sure? I can finish up here while you wait in the ship." Tarkle punched her arm as he passed her, and opened the door to the small biotech room that held the life support systems. "What did I say? I'm fine. We'll get through this faster if we both do it anyway." Ava sighed and hung her suit beside Tarkle's, before moving to the shuttle's main control board to check for irregularities. It was a routine maintenance trip to an infrequently used midpoint shuttle, and if they were lucky, they could solve any issues within an hour and be back to their host planet early in the afternoon. Her communication pad buzzed, and Ava unhooked it from her belt. Central's logo flashed on the screen with her commander's insignia below it. She pressed the button to answer. "What's up, boss?" Mal, her dark grey hair slicked back above her deep eyes, appeared on the screen. Ava wasn't sure if it was her imagination or not, but her boss seemed a little more frazzled than normal. "Oh, good. You're there already. Everything going according to plan?" Ava glanced behind herself, where the room was quiet and still. Yeah, no problem so far. The system says there's only 3 non-critical bugs this time. Should be an easy job. Good, good. Mal glanced to the side, as though she were listening to someone beyond the screen's view. Ava tried to be patient. A call from her superior during a routine job was unusual, unless there was an emergency. Mal glanced back at Ava and pushed a determined smile onto her face. Just wanted to check that you and Tarkle are going okay. Isn't that what she just asked? Yeah, things are fine. Should be out of here soon. Good, good. And neither of you have any sort of symptoms? Ava hesitated and glanced at the biotech room, where she could see the bases of Tarkle's boots as he worked on the cabling under the water reclaimer. Well, actually, Tarkle's come down with something. He said he'd probably caught it from his wife before he left. Ah. Mal turned to the side and spoke to the person Ava couldn't see. Her voice was too quiet for Ava to hear most of what she said, but Ava managed to catch. Was she one of them? Mal's face darkened. She turned back to Ava. Her smile evaporated and took a deep breath before speaking. Captain James, there's a potentially dangerous disease passing through the stations. We have the situation under control at our base, but I suspect Captain Chamel may have contracted it before his deployment this morning. Ava frowned at her boss, confused by the suddenly formal dialogue. She'd always gotten on well with Mal, to the point of being at first-name basis and joining her for drinks on evenings when they had to work late. She wasn't sure what to make of the suddenly official tone. So, should we come back straight away? Mal paused for a moment before answering, and Ava hated seeing the creases building around her mouth. No. Your orders are to remain where you are. Move Captain Chamel into quarantine immediately and avoid any contact with him. I'll send a medic crew to retrieve you as soon as possible. As soon as possible? Ava glanced at Tarkle's boots, barely visible through the doorway. How soon's that going to be? Within the next hour? As soon as possible. Mal repeated, then glanced aside. This time her companion's voice was loud enough for Ava to hear the urgent tones, but not the words. Ava, I have to go now. Get Tarkle into quarantine and stay safe. Stay safe? Ava echoed, but Mal had already ended the communication. Frustrated, Ava clipped the box back onto her belt and scowled at the shuttle. And where exactly am I supposed to quarantine someone on this heap of junk? Hey, Tarkle! Her companion didn't answer. Ava approached the biotech room as anxiety began to flutter in her chest. Tarkle was kneeling on the ground, apparently lost in thought as he stared at the cables. Ava had to rap her knuckles on the door twice before he rocked back onto his heels and looked at her. Jeez, Ava said, lost for words. Tarkle had looked bad before, but he'd degenerated to ghastly in the few short minutes they'd been separated. His hair was plastered to his face, which dripped sweat. His skin, normally a healthy bronze, had turned grey, and his lips were tinged blue. His unfocused eyes roved the room before settling on Ava. Huh? He said, and a trickle of saliva ran from the corner of his mouth to mix with his sweat. Ava swore and covered her mouth and nose with her sleeve so she wouldn't inhale any pathogens. Is it a virus, though? I've never seen any sort of disease move this quickly. Tarkle keeled forward, and his hands flopped against his stomach as though to knock away an unpleasant sensation. Ava stared, transfixed, as her partner lurched back and his stomach swelled under his uniform. Fear fought through the confusion, and Ava remembered that she was supposed to quarantine her partner. She reached for the door to wrench it closed, but a second before she could, Tarkle's suit and stomach split open, spilling a series of long grey worm-like creatures onto the floor. A scream rose in Ava's throat, but she choked it off before it could leave her mouth. Her partner rocked backwards, his body collapsing against the network of cables, as the parasites that had grown inside him pulled forward, stretching towards Ava. She slammed the door against them and stumbled backwards, shock turning her limbs to putty. The parasites made wet, sticking noises as they pressed against the door. Ava skidded backwards as far as the cramped room would allow her, then dropped to the ground and pulled her knees up under her chin. She fumbled the communication unit off her belt and pressed the emergency button. Then she stared at the screen as the little connection circles cycled around and around. Their phones can't be that busy, surely, unless this thing is spreading. She could hear the creatures moving. Their slimy, grey bodies slid across the floor and walls as they searched for a gap to escape through. She didn't want to think about what would happen if, rather, when they found a way out. Please, Mel, send the rescue team quickly. Chapter 48. The Cleaners. Geez, wow! Jerry opened the car door to get a better look at the 3-story mansion towering above him. The day had been hot and sunny when they'd left the town 40 minutes before, but thick clouds had blotted out most of the natural light and left him feeling chilled. "You've been coming here every day for the last week?" he asked, incredulous as his cousin killed the car's ignition and undid his seatbelt. Ash gave him a toothy smile. "And been paid 3 times what I was making at my old job." "How exactly did you get this gig again?" Ash slid out of his seat and rounded the car to retrieve his supplies. "Craigslist. Put myself up as a professional cleaning company. No one checks your references, and it's simple enough to fake certificates and letters of recommendation. It's an easy job anyway." "Easy," Jerry repeated, staring at the building. "I'd call this the opposite of easy." Ash, holding a mop and bucket in one hand, and with spare cloth slung over his shoulder, gave Jerry's back a slap as he passed him. "It's not that bad on the inside. Just help me out for a day or two until I'm back on schedule, okay? Grab the spare boxes so we can haul some of the junk out." Jerry rubbed at the back of his neck, then sighed and retrieved the empty boxes before following his cousin up the weed-choked gravel driveway. It had sounded like an easy job when Ash had called him the night before. "I'm cleaning a friend's home, but I'm a bit behind schedule. Want to help out for the day? I'll pay you $50. Of course, he hadn't learnt until that morning that it was actually a paid job. And it wasn't a simple declutter and dust task either. The elderly woman who had lived in the house had passed away a fortnight before, and her family wanted the building thoroughly cleaned before they put it up for sale. Jerry swore under his breath and ran up the porch steps to where Ash had propped the door open with a rock. The foyer looked reasonably clean. Furniture had been shoved into a corner, waiting either to be sold or carted away in a dump truck. An archway to the right led into an old-fashioned sitting room. Jerry's mouth dropped open as he turned in a slow circle, amazed by the opulence surrounding him. The gold-leafed sconces lining the walls matched the chandelier hanging high above his head, and the chandelier, in turn, matched the grungy marble tiles below his feet. "This is incredible." "It's sure something, huh? The guy who hired me said it was built in the 1800s, when the woman who lived here was a young child." "What? Seriously? But wouldn't that make her, over 100? "That's what he said." "I've got to finish in the kitchen. I didn't get through it last night, but it's a bit small for 2 of us. Why don't you head upstairs and pick a room? Just clear out any drawers, carry as much of the furniture downstairs as you can, and vacuum the floors." "Clear out? What do I do with it?" Ash shrugged as he backed towards the sitting room, dragging the mop in his wake. "If it looks super important, put it to one side. Otherwise, toss it all in the box to throw out. I already asked the owner, and he doesn't want any memorabilia kept." "Right." Ash disappeared from view, and Jerry was left facing the curved stairway leading to the 2nd floor. He cleared his throat, picked up one of the empty boxes, and began climbing. The steps groaned under his weight, and Jerry couldn't help but wonder how long it had been since they'd been used regularly. If the owner was over 100, she must have lived in the downstairs rooms, surely. The dark, musty hallway stretched ahead of him, coated in red wallpaper that had faded with age. Jerry tried the first room, but Ash had already cleared it. The second opened into a bathroom, which he skipped, but the third brought him to a cluttered bedroom. "Okay, you got this," Jerry said, clutching the box tightly. The room looked long disused. A huge wardrobe sat recessed into one wall, opposite a bureau, a small desk, and an empty shelf. Though the room had clearly been meant as a bedroom, it had no bed. Jerry dropped his box beside the bureau and pulled open the first drawer, expecting linen. To his surprise, it was filled with piles of handwritten notes on aging yellowed paper. He leafed through a few pages, but the old-fashioned scrawl was indecipherable, so he dropped the papers into his box and went back for another handful. A picture slipped out and fluttered to the floor, and Jerry bent to pick it up. It showed 4 women, all dressed in heavy Victorian garb and with their hair pulled back into tight buns, sitting in a semicircle. The picture was small and grainy, but the women all seemed to wear an identical, inscrutable expression as they gazed at the camera. He squinted at a shape in the background, then lowered the picture to look at the wardrobe set into the back of the room. They were one and the same. The way the women were arranged around the wardrobe seemed to suggest it had some sort of significance. "Weird," Jerry muttered. He dropped the image into the box, where it landed on an ink-stained butcher's receipt. Jerry moved quickly through the first drawer, dumping its contents into the box after a quick scan for obviously valuable paperwork. Halfway down, he came across a gold-embossed certificate. Awarded to Miss Myrtle Vorshalis for exceptional contributions to the field of cryptozoology. Cryptozoology? Jerry had heard the word before, though he couldn't remember what it meant. The certificate looked expensive and important, but if it had been left forgotten in a room that was never used, he couldn't imagine anyone still living wanted it. Into the box you go. With the top drawer emptied, he bent his head to check that he hadn't missed anything. Snagged between the base and the back of the drawer was a second photograph. Jerry reached into the bureau and plucked it out. What he saw set his heart thundering and sweat developing across his back. The 4 women still sat posed around the wardrobe. This time, however, its doors were open, and inside was something Jerry couldn't even begin to explain. It was huge, taller than a human, and had multiple limbs extending from its elongated torso. Its head reminded him of an ibis's, except it seemed more like a skull than living tissue. Hollows filled the space where the eyes should have been, and the long, thin beak stretched down in front of its body. The limbs were all scrawny and multi-jointed like a spider's, and though it was hard to discern in the picture, the skin seemed leathery. Its arms had been spread out and fixed to the back of the wardrobe, as though the furniture were an impromptu display case. Jerry turned slowly to look at the dark doors set into the wall. He dropped the photograph and took 2 steps towards the stained wood. "Ash?" he called, hoping his voice would carry through the old house. "Yeah?" his cousin bellowed from the kitchen below. Jerry fastened his sweating palms on the door handles. "What's cryptozoology?" "I know that, isn't it like, Jerry pulled on the handles and tugged the doors wide open. "It's the study of mythical animals, isn't it?" Jerry didn't reply. He was captivated and shocked and amazed and appalled by the sight in front of him. The creature, standing nearly a foot taller than he did, remained in the wardrobe. Its limbs still nailed to the wooden sides. Its empty eye socket stared out of the bird-like head, and its leathery skin sagged about its ancient frame. Jerry met the skull's empty gaze, and he could have sworn he heard a quiet rattle as the beast exhaled. Chapter 49. Experimental. Arlo stretched, then lounged back in his chair. He had his phone propped up against the back of the desk, playing that night's footy match, and his ice pack had done a decent job of keeping the beer cold. His shift at the Argent Research and Development Labs wouldn't finish for another hour, but it was the quietest part of his day. Most of the labs had already been vacated, leaving just the deadline chasers and obsessives to burn the midnight oil. Arlo's desk phone rang, jolting him out of his daze. He grabbed the receiver and tried to sound more alert than he was. "Arlo here." "Hey," the voice said. "Everything okay down there?" Arlo recognized the voice as belonging to the property owner, Mr. Chase. He carefully nudged the beer farther out of sight under the desk, despite knowing his boss couldn't see it. "Yeah, all good here. I'm going to need you to check on Dr. Buford on level 4 West Wing. I've had a couple of noise complaints. Tell him to keep the volume down, okay?" "Sure thing." Arlo waited to hear the click as Mr. Chase hung up, then took his tools, a flashlight and a notebook, out of the drawer and tucked them into his pocket. Then he marched down the empty tile hallway to the lifts at the opposite end of the room. As he waited for the doors to open, he tried to remind himself of who Dr. Buford was. He would have seen him every morning as the building's occupants filed in, and again every night as they filtered out. He ran through the faces that passed across his mind, trying unsuccessfully to match names to them. The elevator doors opened. Arlo stepped inside, pressed the button for level 4, and waited for the lift to take action. The Argent Labs were leased to a wide variety of industry professionals. Because of its location in the heart of the city, rent was expensive, and the labs had a reputation for housing some of the greatest minds of their generation. At least that was what Arlo had been told. All he saw was a lot of bickering and occasionally smashed equipment when an experiment failed. As the elevator doors opened, Arlo snapped his fingers. He'd remembered Dr. Buford, the shortish man with a ruffle of graying brown hair and the permanent frown. While most of the tower's occupants said good morning as they passed the guard station, Arlo didn't think he'd ever spoken to the scientist. Arlo turned right, towards the West Wing, and followed it until he found Dr. Buford's door. To his surprise, the lab's lights were off. Maybe he took a different lift down while I was coming up. He didn't expect it to work, so Arlo felt a small shiver of surprise when the door opened with a nudge. As he stepped into the lab, he felt on the wall beside the door for the light switch and pressed it. The room stayed dark. Maybe he overloaded the generator. It wouldn't be the first time it's happened. Arlo pulled out his torch and switched it on. As the narrow beam of light skimmed over the shadowed shapes cluttering the space, unease grew across Arlo's skin. It wasn't the standard mess. The lab was destroyed. Chairs had been overturned, expensive-looking equipment lay shattered on the ground, and the largest table had been crushed. Stains coated the wall closest to him. Computers had been torn apart. Arlo licked his dry lips and stepped into the room. Glass crunched under his shoes. He stepped back, then looked towards the ceiling. It wasn't a power outage after all. The bulbs had been broken. "Dr. Buford?" Arlo kept his voice low for reasons he couldn't fathom. "Hello?" No voice answered. But as he held his breath, Arlo was sure he heard something stir deeper in the room. He moved forward cautiously, sweeping his torch over the debris and being careful to step around the broken glass and torn book pages. He passed the largest desk and saw something under the smaller bench. It looked almost like feet. Arlo crouched so that his torchlight could illuminate the rest of the figure, and his breath seized in his throat. The familiar scowling face stared back, its eyes wide and wild, its skin horrifically pale. Rivers of blood dripped from where the back of the head had been torn away. Arlo gagged and lurched backwards. He bumped into something solid. and turned to see one of the large reinforced crates he'd often seen the scientists shipping their live experiments in. The metal reinforcements had been bent, and a human-sized hole had been punctured in the side. Oh! Arlo turned towards the door, just as something nudged it closed. Chapter 50. In the space above the wardrobe. The rain drumming at Laura's window nearly drowned out her cat's wheezing. Octavius, the ancient tabby, lay curled beside her pillow. Later in the night, as the temperature dropped, he was likely to burrow under her blankets to leech off her body heat. "You doing okay, champ?" Laura asked as Octavius gave an extra gurgly exhale. He blinked slowly in response. The vet had said he was doing remarkably well for his age, and Laura had interpreted that as a gentle warning that she might not have her childhood pet with her for much longer. She turned back to her phone and continued scrolling as she filtered through her Facebook feed in case anything new had cropped up. It was well past her usual bedtime, and she was procrastinating in the vain hope that the rain might stop, so she could have an undisturbed sleep. When it rained at night, her dreams were always erratic and disturbing, and they often devolved into nightmares before morning arrived. Octavius gave an extra deep wheeze, and Laura looked at him. His eyes, fixed on something above her head, had widened into the perfect circles he usually reserved for when he begged for food or saw another cat on the backyard fence. Laura followed his gaze towards the dark patch above her wardrobe in the corner of her room. There was only a foot of space between the wardrobe and the ceiling, which meant neither the room's light nor Laura's lamp were able to completely scatter the shadows there. Laura squinted into the darkness, but as far as she could tell, it was empty. "What's the matter? Seen a moth?" She gave Octavius's head a brief scratch. The cat showed his front fangs, and a low rumble echoed from his throat. Laura turned back to the corner, suddenly uncertain. Octavius really seemed to think something was there. Even though she couldn't see anything, Laura found herself focused on the area, matching her cat's gaze, as though a shape could appear in the thin block of shadows at any moment. "Enough," Laura said, shaking herself out of the stupor and putting her phone back on the bedside table. Octavius maintained his stare, and although she thought his tail might be a little puffed, he was no longer growling. "I don't know what's up with you tonight, Oct, but you'd better get over it. Good night." She gave her cat's head a final scratch, not that he responded, then turned off her bedside lamp and wiggled under her covers. The rain continued to beat at the window, creating a strange symphony with Octavius's thick breathing and the ticking clock. Laura closed her eyes and tried to sink into sleep, but she was excruciatingly aware that Octavius was still next to her and that his wide eyes continued to focus on the shadowed corner. Sometime during the next half hour, between the beating rain and wheezing breaths, Laura fell into an unpleasant, disturbed sleep. She dreamed she'd rolled over and opened her eyes to see the creature crouched above her wardrobe. It was entirely black, which allowed it to blend into the shadows perfectly. Water dripped from its moist, leathery skin and ran down the sides of the bookcase to soak into the carpet. Its eyes were the worst. They were large and round, with horizontal pupils like a cat's. They flicked from Octavius to Laura's sleeping form, back and forth, as hunger drew its lips apart to expose the many rows of shiny white teeth packed inside its mouth. Laura started awake with a gasp. It took her a moment to remember where she was. Then she scrambled to turn on her bedside lamp and scanned the space above her wardrobe. Empty. She sighed and rubbed her palms against her eyelids. A low rumble from her side drew her attention to Octavius. He was crouched in the space beside her pillow with his hackles raised and his bushy tail curled around his body defensively. His huge green eyes remained fixed on the corner of the room, the space where she dreamed she'd seen the creature. "There's nothing there," Laura said, more to reassure herself than to calm her cat. She looked back at the corner for the final time. Something glistened on the side of her wardrobe. Water drops, catching her lamp's light, dribbling down the wood towards the carpet. Laura opened her mouth, but no noise escaped. Lightning flashed through Laura's window and dispersed the darkness in the corner of the room. The split second of sharp white light was just enough to illuminate the leathery flesh, the wide, hungry eyes, and the long, shiny teeth hidden in the darkest corner of the space above the wardrobe. The end. You have been listening to Small Horrors by Darcy Coates, narrated by Shane Emmett.